Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Je m'appelle John Packer. Je suis le directeur du Centre de recherche et d'enseignement des droits de la personne ici à l'Université d'Ottawa. My name is John Packer. I'm the director of the Human Rights Research and Education Center at the University of Ottawa. Et c'est mon grand plaisir aujourd'hui de vous accueillir de notre panel, notre événement qui va adresser le Human Rights-Based Approach, donc l'approche basée de droits de la personne pour la réalisation des droits de la personne. So this is a method or approach for realizing human rights. And today our focus will be specifically around the right to adequate housing, or in relation to housing rights, and applications in this main range, and also looking at some questions around other human rights-based approaches, in particular education and the fulfillment of the development of the child. So it's my pleasure to, before introducing the speakers, also to welcome those of you joining us today. It's our practice at the University of Ottawa and at the Human Rights Research and Education Center to acknowledge the place from which we're addressing you. And I'm actually addressing you from New York City right now. So this is the wonder of international, the world in which we live through technology. But our Human Rights Center is based in the unceded and unsurrendered Anishinaabe lands of the uOttawa, the basin around the Ottawa River. And we usually acknowledge not only that fact, but we also pay respect to the persons who came before, the elders, the knowledge keepers, and others for whom this space, this area where the University of Ottawa is located, has had great benefit over millennia. And also which tolerate or accept those of us who are enjoying the opportunity to be in this space today. Je vous adresse de la langue anglaise parce qu'aujourd'hui notre événement se déroulera en anglais. So today I'm addressing you in English because our event will be in the English language. But if, si vous voulez poser une question ou peut-être partager un commentaire, vous êtes également bienvenue de poser ou pour parler en français. You can do that by, you can address yourself in English or French through the Q&A function. Let me also note that this recording, this panel and event is being recorded. Donc, on verra aussi l'opportunité à l'avenir de le revisiter, revoir, si vous voulez, ou vos amis. So I welcome you if you wish, because we are recording this to check later and to circulate, disseminate, or invite your friends to watch this. The last thing I'll mention is that this panel and event comes out of a course which the last 2 years I have been the professor, the titular professor for, but very much engaged in its delivery with the close cooperation of my colleague, Slava Balan, who will be moderating this panel. And that's a course on the human rights-based approach to not just to implementing human rights, but to governance, law, and policy in really across the board in terms of public authority. And so this comes out of it. And today we have, we will benefit from contributors, 2 of the star students from that last session, Van Armenian and Lola Soten. So we're delighted to have them to share their view and their specific perspective. Slava Balan will moderate. He is specialized on this, and he is a lawyer from originally Moldova, has worked for the United Nations and other organizations, and is specialized in his doctoral studies on the human rights-based approach. So he's really probably the most advanced person I know, and certainly at the University of Ottawa on this topic. And then the final speaker we have By no means the least speaker we have is Dr. David Debaye, who earned a year or two ago, I can't remember now, his doctorate in law from Université Québec and Montréal. But Dr. Debaye, you're also, if I'm not mistaken, a graduate from the University of Ottawa, I recall. So it's nice, and I know that we enjoyed your participation in some years past in, for example, our humanitarian law course and things like that. So it's great to have Dr. Debaye, who is a postdoctoral fellow and did a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Ottawa Human Rights Center under the supervision of our colleague, Dr. Darren O'Toole, Professor Darren O'Toole. So that's our group. I should shut up now because I've spoken too long. So with pleasure, I now turn the chairmanship or the moderation to Slava Vela.
Thank you so much for this introduction of our event. And I, again, will not spend too much time because basically the framework was already set by Professor Parker for this event. Just several words, a little bit of where the human rights-based approach comes from and how it landed here in Canada and what its relevance now is for Canada. So human rights-based approach is a relatively new but rather old kind of approach which emerged about 20 years ago, basically as an approach to better operationalize human rights, to mainstream human rights into all relevant fields. And when we are saying about these relevant fields, it's virtually everything which surrounds us, it's education, housing, everything which is connected to human rights. So this approach initially emerged within the United Nations. However, it has spread since then across not just international assistance, but also to national policy and lawmaking. And just recently, together with Professor Parker, we have authored a small piece about how human rights-based approach gets roots in Scotland, getting more and more exposure to all of the kind of lawmaking and policy making in Scotland. And the same movements or the same process could be observed also in Canada, although not as fast as in Scotland, but there are already quite a number of places where human rights-based approach is visible. So one is kind of a usual suspect, it's the international assistance, the Canadian feminist international assistance policy directly refers to human rights-based approach as the approach for the Canada's operations abroad. Another one is the housing. So the most recent Canadian strategy, or the first actual Canadian strategy on housing, is claimed to be based on human rights. I will not say more about that because we have two presenters today who will speak about that more in detail. That's Dr. Debaye and Lola Soten. And there are some other fields in Canada which need human rights-based approach. So together with Professor Parker within the course in fall, with the students who are part of this course, we have started exploring these other areas, other fields. And today is the event where we would like to share with you, the students, and Dr. Debaye, these perspectives. So where are the perspectives for human rights-based approach in Canada? Obviously, this is not an exclusive and conclusive list of areas, but this is just kind of to set the tone, to show some of the places where human rights-based approach could bring change, transformation, and positive results. So here I will stop and I will pass the floor to Dr. David Debaye, who will address some remarks concerning human rights and housing. Dr. Debaye, please. We may ask you speaking a little bit closer to the microphone, yes, and to the... No.
You were sounding not quite connected, David.
How about this? Is that better?
Perfect.
That, okay.
Perfect. Yes, please. Thanks.
I apologize for the technical difficulties. But thank you very much for this. This is an opportunity for me to learn, actually, because I don't know a great deal about the human rights-based approach in terms of the way that it's integrated into Canadian policies. I think, like most of us, I'm very narrowly focused in my research, and unfortunately, that means that I miss things. So, for instance, yeah, I wasn't aware of the policy on international assistance that Slava just alluded to. However, he did also mention something that I'm very familiar with, which is the National Housing Strategy. And in fact, I did publish a paper recently. I'm going to plug my work here shamelessly, but I did publish in the Canadian Journal of Law Society a co-written piece with Sarah Hamill, who is at Trinity College in Dublin. And the piece actually looks at the NHS, human rights, housing rights, and something called Housing First, which is a kind of model for dealing with homelessness that is very widely used in Canada and internationally, specifically in Finland, and has produced very positive results in both Canada, Finland, and many other places where it's been applied. And it is a very good example of a human rights-based approach model, because at the heart of Housing First is the notion that housing is a basic human right. So let me just very quickly, I prepared a few notes on this specific article, which I mentioned just now, and I may actually put it in the chat later if anyone wants to click on that. It's actually it's a public domain, so it's accessible to everyone. And I was asked by the organizers, Slava and John, to talk a little bit about the way that housing rights and housing first have been implemented in Finland, and whether that example is a model for Canada, a quote unquote best practice, to use a very managerial term. And based on my own research and what I have seen elsewhere, it is a very good model for Canada. And as a matter of fact, I make this case in my paper. So just briefly, I want to outline what the Finnish model of housing first, and in fact, a human rights-based approach to homelessness is. It's not that old. It dates to 2008. It's known as the PAVO program, and it's essentially a national anti-homelessness strategy. And as I said before, it relies very, very heavily on the housing first model. Finland is a very centralized state, and this strategy involved multiple national ministries and local governments. And between 2008 and 2015, the plan was developed. And without going into too much detail, what they did was they replaced almost all of the existing infrastructure for homelessness, and I mean in particular homeless shelters, with social housing. So the idea was to go from emergency shelters, which provide beds on a short-term basis, to something that was long-term and sustainable, and that would provide a more permanent solution to the challenge of homelessness in Finland. Now, Finland is like many countries in the world, actually does reference the right to housing. I don't think I need to quote the article of the Finnish Constitution, but it is enshrined in their formal constitution. And it's interesting because it's not the constitutional guarantee that makes the Paavo plan remarkable. It's not really the reason that Finland is held up as a model for success in terms of eliminating homelessness is because yes, there's a legal right. It's not specifically the article dealing with housing. It's actually the connection between the right to life and homelessness, which the courts have actually read into the Finnish constitution and have essentially made the right to housing justiciable in Finland.
So David, if you may just a bit closer to the microphone again, because
Sorry,
the sound again
okay.
is a bit worse. Yes.
Okay, how about, is that better? Can you hear me now?
A bit.
A bit better, yeah. So it differs in the Housing First programs in Finland differ in a few key ways from some of the Housing First models that you'll see in Canada. And there are many, many different approaches to the implementation of this model. In Finland, they really put the emphasis on what is called chronic homelessness. In other words, long-term homelessness, and people who will be most vulnerable in terms of not having access to shelter, sleeping rough, and so on. So the Paavo strategy also opted to follow what is called a single site rather than a scattered site approach. These are details, but they're important if you compare them to what happens in Canada, because in Canada it does tend to be much more scattered throughout a given municipality or region. And again, the idea of turning the shelters, and in Finland they did something really quite radical, which is they through an agreement with the Finnish YMCA, they turned the homeless shelters in the Y into self-contained apartments, and these became essentially social housing units subsidized by the Finnish government. So now getting back to Canada, because I was also asked to comment on the national housing strategy. And I think the particular question for us today is really, is it a human rights-based approach? And again, this is something that I broached in my paper. The answer, as you might imagine, is yes and no. The strategy that the federal government finally legislated in 2019, and I want to emphasize this is very recent, does mention the progressive realization of the right to adequate housing as recognized in the second covenant, the ICESCR. And that is something in and of itself, that is a breakthrough. And in addition to the legislation making reference to international human rights norms, there is a number of regulatory bodies, advisory bodies that came out of the legislation in 2019. And these bodies have legal mandates that are sort of quasi-judicial, and that I guess it's worth discussing them a little bit more, and I will be doing that. But I'd like to tell you a little bit more about the goals of the NHS, the objectives of the National Housing Strategy first. So the NHS also, like the Finnish example, really puts the emphasis on chronic homelessness, long-term homelessness. That's important because long-term homelessness is the tip of the iceberg in terms of access to housing. It's the most obvious one. It's the one that we see. It's the visible homelessness that you see in the street. Therefore, it is the most urgent example of homelessness. But of course, there is a much broader category of homelessness, which includes lots of people who don't sleep rough, who don't necessarily use emergency shelters, who are nonetheless homeless and don't have a permanent address. And that has all kinds of implications for their human rights. But the NHS does promise to eliminate chronic homelessness between now and 2028. And it promises to do this by a number of different means, but it's not clear whether housing first is actually going to be applied, even though housing first remains the sort of preferred standard, I think, federally in Canada, and has been for quite a long time, even before the NHS. And it does talk about progressively realizing the right to housing in Canada. So I guess what we're left with is the question, does this wonderful strategy, which promises so much and does espouse the ideals of human rights, does it actually provide the practical means and the resources and money that realizing the right to housing requires? And I think it's important to say that though the NHS explicitly makes a commitment to progressive realization of the right to housing, there remains no effective redress for the violation of this right. Should people be, should they remain homelessness? It should be noted that Housing First in Canada, which is the preferred policy in reducing homelessness, it fails to grant homeless people any form of redress should they remain unhoused. And given the fact that the National Housing Strategy seems to put a lot of emphasis and seems to depend a lot on the private rental market, it's very difficult to imagine the scenario where the federal government is able to resolve the housing crisis and get people into housing when there are shortages of affordable housing in every major city in Canada. And there are, of course, examples, and you mentioned, Salva mentioned Scotland. Scotland is a jurisdiction with an enforceable right to housing, in addition to a strategy for dealing with homelessness. So, I guess the conclusion really is that the NHS is in some ways a half measure. And of course, it is better than nothing. But it does not actually deal with the prima facie violation of the right to housing that homelessness represents. And, until we tackle the shortage of affordable housing in a very serious way, it matters very little actually to people on the street whether they have a right to housing or not. So I'm afraid I'm a little bit negative, a little bit skeptical at this point. But again, we're talking about a law that dates 2019, so we shall see. Slava, do I have time to talk about the housing advocate, the federal housing advocate, or should we move on to the next speaker?
No, I think that's already a good kind of step of this introduction into the eventual human rights-based approach to housing. Because again, from your presentation, it's clear that at least at the level of formulations, like statements, housing is recognized as a human right, and there is even an explicit reference to human rights-based approach, these 4 words, right in the strategy and the act, Housing Strategy Act, which is obviously always a good step. However, just actually echoing my recent kind of research and readings, it seems that Canada is still at this so-called rhetoric formulaic stage, when somehow the approach is acknowledged as an approach, yet the implementation becomes a serious issue. In addition to some of the elements which you already mentioned in your presentation, I think further elements will be kind of presented or provided by Lola, whom I would like also to invite to speak on issue of homelessness and human rights-based approach. So Lola took her own take on this issue, very much looking at what is visible, what actually the Canadian government puts on the website or in the official documents. And let's see from Lola how the human rights-based approach and some other elements of the human rights-based approach look for a person who tries to assess the publicly available or publicly visible information on the Canadian homelessness approach. Lola, please, the floor is yours. And just put on your mic, yeah, and okay. I think, yeah, Lola has a presentation for today, so she'll be speaking with a presentation. Please, Lola.
Hello, everyone. I hope you're able to hear me loud and clear.
Yes.
Everything's perfect. Hello, my name is Lola Soten. I am an honors in criminology with a law minor student. I firstly want to obviously thank Professor John Parker and Salva Bolon and members of the Human Rights Research and Education Center for giving me this amazing opportunity to speak before you guys today. I will be speaking about the human rights-based approach to homelessness in Canada. So homelessness is more than simply a lack of permanent residence, obviously. It causes physical, emotional, territorial, ontological, and spiritual deprivation. Homelessness in Canada disproportionately affects Indigenous people, Black and racialized communities, people with disabilities, mental health and addiction issues, women and children that have experienced domestic violence, people in poverty, the LGBTQ+ community, and the youth. Therefore, homelessness is clearly also a discrimination issue. Human rights approach requires immediate action on homelessness.
I'm sorry, if you want to switch the slides in the meanwhile, because as far as I know, you also have some other slides, right?
I do, but this part of my presentation requires the slide.
Okay, this one. I'm sorry. Yeah, I thought. Yeah, I'm sorry for interrupting you. Yes, please.
It's all good. So human rights approach requires immediate action on homelessness. A human rights perspective requires addressing systematic causes rather than simply reacting to immediate problems, developing a comprehensive policy and funding framework that holds all levels of the government accountable for their roles in preventing homelessness. So creating a prevention framework in accordance with the human rights approach, approaching homelessness and prevention from a rights-based perspective is critical. Several international treaties and agreements ratified by Canada establish that adequate housing access is a fundamental right. This is recognized by the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. In order to prevent homelessness, all levels of the government, I believe, need to work together, including health, childcare, justice, and others. The Canadian National Housing Strategy is based on the National Housing Strategy Act, which is a piece of legislation. In this act, the right to adequate housing is featured as, once again, a fundamental right. So existing prevention legislation for homelessness. So the human rights-based approach takes a form in the homes first approach. It is a specific strategy that is described as a recovery-oriented approach to eradicating homelessness that focuses on quickly resettling those experiencing homelessness in independent and permanent housing. This is one idea. Well, it is a proactive approach that can help keep people out of homelessness. Also, housing should be built in close proximity to public transportations, jobs, and services. Thanks to improved federal homelessness programs, veterans, women, and children fleeing domestic violence will be given the opportunity for national housing. So the human rights-based approach element and dimension. So the first human rights-based approach question is stated at the top there. Is there a link between Canada's national housing strategy and human rights? Is there? Well, according to the human rights-based approach, every policy, program, or activity must promote human rights. It is clearly stated that housing is once again a human right. According to the National Housing Strategy, therefore, the answer to this first question, I believe, in relation to the National Housing Strategy is positive. Yes, it is linked to human rights. Second question is the Canadian Housing Strategy non-discriminatory? The human rights-based approach requires that any policy, program, or action identify the most vulnerable social groups, directly target them, as well as to find out the root causes of inequality. I believe that the focal point of these policies should be focused on vulnerable groups like Indigenous people, racialized minorities, women, and groups alike. To understand and address the root causes of homelessness, especially in today's world, the needs of the most vulnerable groups, once again, must be top priority in the government's effort to addressing housing shortages. The governmental policies direct its effort towards creating clear incentives that are centered around alleviating the housing strategies, the housing struggles, of Indigenous people, minority groups, women, and groups alike. The Canadian Housing Strategy website caters more, I believe, to corporations and construction companies. This is an issue. It doesn't actually cater to vulnerable people who are actually actively homeless and need help with their homelessness. So the third question here is the Canada's National Housing Strategy transparent? Well, the Human Rights Business Act requires right holders to be change agents rather than passive recipients of policies and programs and actions. According to this requires explicit vulnerable group participation in decision-making, empowerment, and accountability of implements in front of vulnerable groups, which are the beneficiaries. To develop sound housing policy, government, municipalities, the social and corporate sectors, and those directly affected by housing insecurity must communicate openly and transparently. So finally, is the Canada's National Housing Strategy empowering? Well, the ability to exercise one's human right influences one's identity and life choices. Achieving equality of opportunities requires equal access to human rights. The government's efforts to regulate the housing industry to empower the most vulnerable people, in my opinion, failed. As duty bearers, they must do more to empower those who lack economic, decision-making, and social power as a result of housing strategy implementation. They should be given more power and leverage in housing decisions. Most current policies are just simply ineffective. To promote change, the government must take the lead, not by over-regulating, but by implementing incentives that encourage corporations and construction firms to change towards empowering the most affected by homelessness and housing shortages. National policies and strategy for homelessness. So the most successful countries in combating homelessness have a well-defined national plan. With legislation and resources for local governments and communities, homelessness is often seen as a national policy issue requiring community, nonprofit, and homeless partnerships. Together, we can prevent homelessness. To address the issue raised by the national policies, all levels of government must be actively involved. The most effective national solutions encourage systemic and organized coordination. Interdepartmental coordination and accountability must be increased. Providing structural and transformation solutions to the issue of homelessness through the human rights-based approach. A housing strategy must have appropriate targets, adequate funding, and anti-discrimination legislation. For the national strategy to be truly transformative. It must be decision-making, it must move decision-making away from federal bureaucrats and towards vulnerable people, people who have been homeless or have a strong tie to the affected group, people who can actually appropriately represent these groups. So finally, as we all know, housing insecurity is massive. It is a tangled web of major socio-economical issues that will not resolve themselves. The global financial crisis may have ushered in a new era as well in social and economic policymaking. It is time for us to think bigger. We must look at the bigger picture to end homelessness. We must address the 3 causes and as well as the 3 solutions, which are adequate housing, adequate income, and adequate support services. The human rights approach is the best solution in my opinion. As Gandhi once said, how a society treats its most vulnerable members reflects its overall character. So I hope that my presentation gave you a new perspective on homelessness. Again, regardless of socioeconomic status, each member of our community must be treated with justice, dignity, and respect before social progress can truly occur. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Lola. This is a very great presentation, and really you put very clearly on the table other dimensions or elements of the human rights-based approach, which it seems that are not featured as prominently in the Canadian housing strategy as just the statement that it's rights-based. And I just want to kind of underline once again these key elements and features which Lola just presented. So human rights-based approach is not just about saying that what we are doing is rights-based. Okay, saying this is a starting point. However, it requires much more. As Lola just pointed, any human rights issue is actually connected to many other human rights issues. You know, all human rights are indivisible. So indivisibility is one of the core principles of human rights. And as Lola just mentioned, it's not just about having a building where to sleep during the night. Actually, homelessness affects many, many other rights, human rights, and other parts of life. So that's one of the features of human rights-based approach. This approach actually requires complex view, complex approach. It's not just an isolated effort, I don't know, to build something. Second, Lola very rightfully pointed on the fact that human rights-based approach actually requires a very clear focus on the most vulnerable. So the strategy and everything which is connected with the strategy should very clearly start with the most vulnerable, identify them, and identify the root causes of why these specific vulnerable groups are more homeless than the average Canadians or the other groups. And obviously the next step would be to address these specific vulnerabilities. And finally, Lola, I think, did a great job stressing several times this issue. Empowerment means that the power moves from those who are already empowered to those who do not have the power, the rights holders themselves, the vulnerable rights holders themselves. And I completely agree with Lola that looking at what is available publicly, unfortunately, it seems that the main kind of group which the housing strategy implementers are concerned with are the businesses and construction firms. And this is completely not what the human rights-based approach requires. Actually, most of these discussions, consultations, decision-making should have these very people at the table. And this is where I think there is a big gap. And I think without just addressing this gap, redressing this gap, I think it would be quite difficult for the Canadian government to really advance substantially on the progressive realization of the human right to adequate housing. Thank you, Lola, very much again for your presentation. Excellent points, emphasis. And now I would like to move to another area, which is in the same dire need for human rights-based approach, which is education. And I would like to invite Van Armenian to discuss with us human rights-based approach to inclusion of indigenous perspectives into the educational system of Canada. Van, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ottawa. And thank you very much also for the invitation to participate in this webinar. Yes, my research interests are around education and the power of music, actually. What I'm trying to do is make this link with human rights. The United Nations Common Understanding on the Human Rights-Based Approach explains clearly that any program or policy must encourage the realization of human rights as put into law by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international human rights instruments. An important challenge facing Canada today is the baggage of colonialism that it carries in its education system and how it weighs on Canadian identity. The resulting power imbalances between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples continue to this day and are generationally transferred, leading to the development of skewed identities in both groups. International and national human rights instruments justly call for states parties to provide an education to the child rights holders to promote their development to their fullest potential and to protect the child's inherent dignity. To apply a human rights-based approach to Canadian education policies, we must take a step back and ask, through a positive law lens, is Canada bearing its duties towards Indigenous and non-Indigenous children, the child rights holders, in providing quality education when it comes to presenting Canadian history and identity? With the 2015 Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report, Canada received clear recommendations for substantive shifts in its settler state architectures in several policy areas. The chairman of the TRC, Senator Murray Sinclair, eloquently indicated the best path to approach such a challenge for Canadian society. Education is what got us in this mess, he says, and education is the key to reconciliation. So let's educate ourselves a bit, if you allow. An interesting and I believe important concept developed by Cree scholar Dwayne Donald is derived from what he calls a particular four-cornered version of imperial geography that has been transplanted on lands perceived as empty and unused, or more commonly known as the fort. Canadian Indigenous relationships have been based on this narrative of division, disconnect, and distrust that Donald aptly describes as fort logic or mentality. This logic decided, and indeed continues to decide, what Indigenous worldviews are, in quotes, good enough to enter the fort, and what, to Euro-Western logic, must stay out of the fort. This fort logic continues to this day. We are still selecting what is worthwhile. We are still granting this and that, imposing worldviews of the settler state on these lands. As Dene scholar Glenn Coulthard says, the master-sanctioned narrative akin to master-slave relations is alive and well. As this structural violence against Indigenous peoples continues, I argue that consequently, non-Indigenous Canadian children inherit an identity tainted with the ideologies of colonial racism that render invisible Indigenous presence. The human rights-based approach, raison d'être, of course, is to ensure that the most vulnerable segments of society get their fair share of human rights, as Lola and Slava explained. Children certainly qualify to be in this vulnerable category. Hence, my interest in taking this journey to try to provide fortitude to my argument through human rights instruments. The solution I argue for is the D Genociding of Canada by offering all Canadians, and I stress all Canadian learners, a consistent and meaningful relationship with their environment through land-based Indigenous metaphors, histories, and aesthetics. I argue that this will lead to the child gaining a national identity imbued with dignity and understanding. The TRC provides several calls to action to the Canadian government to pave a path towards reconciliation. These calls could be considered a good starting point for a HRBA analysis on education in Canada. Several calls deal with Indigenous culture promotion and financing for Indigenous peoples, but all the calls fall short of demanding substantive shifts in the curriculum of Canada, in Canadian curriculum. Several calls, nevertheless, denounce continued Canadian affinities to the ideas of doctrine of discovery and terra nullius. There is mention of integrating Indigenous knowledge and teaching methods into classrooms and developing, for example, K-12 curriculum and learning resources on Aboriginal peoples in Canadian history. So part of the path, I think, is done, but perhaps the wording should be stronger. When we look at decades of international declarations, agreements, encouragements, recognitions, comments, proclamations, and conventions that pertain to the quality of education we owe to our children, and couple that with the knowledge of the innate dignity of every child, we have ample incentive to act. The stage seems already set for colonial societies like Canada to finally pay their dues for the rampage of destruction they have caused since the papal machinations of the doctrine of discovery. Our history textbooks would have to reflect the millennia of knowledge embedded in Indigenous cultures. The curriculum would necessarily be modified to represent the generally accepted culture regions of Canada. Canadian children would finally have access to the coded origin stories, values, morals, history, and traditions of the land found in Indigenous stories and song. We are obviously not there yet. Any HRBA assessment of Canada's education system will necessarily need to take this non-ratification into account. My conclusions could be summed up as follows. The education system in Canada has deep scars that still need healing. The path for reparation towards Indigenous populations is obvious. Proactively fund Indigenous schools, Indigenous cultural revival, training, promotion, teaching, healthcare, funded. For non-Indigenous Canadian children, and this is rarely talked about, by maintaining the ontological status quo, we bequeath them, as Walker describes, racism through erasure. We reinforce settler entitlement and racist foundations, or as Grande terms, white stream. The Western exceptionalism narrative and the idea of the West and the passive ahistorical arrest must be overcome and replaced by new regimes of knowledge. A de facto reset button needs to be pushed. There is certain movement to decolonize K-12 education in Canada, particularly in Ontario and British Columbia. Results are promising, even exciting, The main problem is teacher training. There is an acute lack of familiarity with indigenous worldviews. Transformative models and affirmative strategies will bring forth solutions on how we can live better together in Canada. Our education system in Canada must change its tune in order to better serve its child rights holder by providing quality and meaningful education as required by international human rights law. Failure to do so will contribute to the status quo or the misrepresentation of Indigenous worldviews in the school systems, and therefore the non-compliance with human rights obligations of Canada towards the best possible education of its children. HRBA principles of transparency, empowerment, participation, and accountability need to be the mot du jour. And in the spirit of Indigenous ways of knowing, I would add responsibility as an important element of human rights-based approach. As Sioux author Vine Deloria states, the basic problem is that American society is a rights society, not a responsibilities society. Thank you very much. And once again, thank you for the opportunity to present a little bit of what I'm doing.
Thank you very much, Van, for your presentation. And again, through Van's presentation, we've seen how human rights-based approach could be applied into a completely different field. In this case, it's education. And again, through, I think, Van's presentation, we've seen that human rights-based approach is not just to say that everyone has the right to education. And if we speak about the indigenous perspectives, it's not just mentioning that indigenous peoples lived here long before the Europeans came. It's much more than that. It's actually a very kind of in-depth analysis of what substantially is presented and how substantially, how it's taught, who is teaching, coming from which starting points, entry points. And this is something which, as Van just mentioned, progressive moves are happening, but probably a more complex, more comprehensive human rights-based analysis of the entire field probably has a potential of accelerating this transformation of the Canadian education. So thank you, Van, for your presentation. Again, drawing a little line following this presentation, I just wanted to say that these are just a couple of examples, a couple of introductions in a way on where and how human rights-based approach can transform Canadian society or Canadian areas of interest, of public interest. But human rights-based approach in the very definition says that it's applicable to almost everything, to any field, to any program, any action, any law. So this event today is just in a way to give a taste of what it could be or what it already brought, the human rights-based approach in Finland, in some other places, and in Canada, with the view of continuing this discussion, with the view of opening new doors and more doors for the human rights-based approach. Here, I think it's the time now for the questions from our audience or from the panelists, and comments, additional comments from the panelists, Professor Parker, Dr. De Bayer, on these raised issues. So whoever would like to speak now, please raise a hand, a digital hand in Zoom, or you can put your questions in the chat or questions and answers box. Okay, I think Professor Parker, raise a hand, please.
Thank you. I just have I know time is limited, and in the absence of a more specific detailed question, I'm curious to know, because it seems that this human rights-based approach is a pretty comprehensive paradigm. And we know that it's actually been around for decades from the United Nations, even if it was buried in some small committees and things. But I'm interested to know from each of the panelists, until either they took the course for Van or Lola, or Dr. Debaye and some of your work, is this relatively new for you? And I ask that because I think it is new for a lot of people who work in the field of human rights. And that's surprising to me. That means we're not teaching it generally, because one would think there should be a kind of one of the frameworks that's early on introduced in probably all human rights education. That would be my guess. So it's a general question. Is it new to you? And have you guys found it, aside from applying it now, have you found it helpful? And that's a question to each and all of you. So.
Okay,
Well, I can go
yes.
first. I mean, I've had a career as a violinist, so human rights, I've participated in human rights concerts, perhaps, but the human rights-based approach is new to me. And I understand that even in the school system, human rights in general is not a topic that is gone enough into depth. People are just unaware of human rights and perhaps become numb to events around the world as a consequence. I mean, we see what's happening today, and okay, there's a little more movement for Ukraine, but in Yemen, there's 5 million people starving, and I didn't hear any Yemenis national anthems being performed in any concerts recently. And of course, as an Armenian, with the recent war in Nagorno-Karabakh, where ethnic cleansing was the mot du jour of the Aliyev regime and Turkey, once again, no Armenian anthems being performed, to my knowledge, anywhere on stages. So human rights is a very is really under the carpet, I guess, for now. I mean, nobody's really talking about it. And again, it's our education system that needs to deal with that. Perhaps a little less math and physics and things like that, a little more human rights and music would change the world, really.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Van. Lola, David, please, if you have something, to comment.
Yeah, of
on this
course.
question.
So pertaining to human rights, I feel like prior to this course, I just had a basic knowledge of it, not as in-depth as I was able to go throughout the course, learning with the different modules that we were given. I remember sending an email to Sava explaining how amazing the course is, how much I enjoy it, and how much deeper I want to learn about the human rights-based approach and how it's integrated into society. And yeah, just as you said, Professor, I did not really have a good knowledge about it prior to the course. I feel like the general public probably doesn't, like the average person probably doesn't have like a grand idea of what the human rights-based approach is. But thanks to the course, it has really, really helped me develop my knowledge. And yeah, and it really taught me a lot, especially during this paper as well.
Thank you so much, Lola. Thank you.
I guess it's as well. Very briefly, no. First of all, I'm not taking your course, so I haven't had a chance to really study this HRBA model in any depth. Can you hear me? Or is it
Not well.
Okay.
There's something going on with the microphone. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'm sorry. Gosh. All right. Let's try this. Is that better? Can you hear me now? No. Okay.
Slightly better, but not perfect.
It has a squeak in it.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I don't know what's going on. Anyway, I don't have very much to add at this point. I would just say that the HRBA is something that I'm curious about. I don't think I even applied it in my paper, quite frankly, because from what I understand, it's a very applied approach to human rights that involves, using very specific concepts, tools to promote human rights. And I don't know that I actually have ever really used the HRBA.
Thank you. If I may also just spare a thought, actually, through my research, it seems that in many places, when people do some human rights work, people kind of think that that's automatically qualifies for human rights-based approach. I can even share my kind of personal experience when I just came to Canada, like in 2018, and I think it was a conference, a big conference, like international law conference, taking place here in Ottawa, and I was asking people around, so is human rights-based approach applied in this and this area? And the people would say, yeah, we are already kind of doing the human rights kind of work. So I think many people, when they do some type of human rights work, sort of automatically think that that's already human rights based. And as we've just discussed during this event now, and as my current PhD research shows, human rights based approach is a much more complex and much more, I would say, analytical tool, systemic and analytical tool. So not any human rights activity qualifies for to be called human rights based approach. And I would say that most human rights activities are not qualified to be called human rights based approach. They do some human rights work, but not exactly in the way how this comprehensive human rights based approach would require. So just to give you a very simple example from my also practical work, like in Moldova, for example, or Ukraine, relatively recently already. So any connection of some village to the water pipeline is automatically perceived as a human rights based approach, because look, we are delivering water to the people. Water is a human right, so we are providing this human right. But human rights based approach actually says that yes, delivering of water is a good thing, but it also matters to whom you deliver it first. Are the most vulnerable people getting first this water, or you are connecting to the water the wealthiest kind of families in the village? Because if it's kind of the wealthiest families only in the village that you connect to the water, and you completely leave out the kind of poor families, from human rights based approach, that's very problematic. So it's not exactly rights based. You basically discriminate in delivering a human right. And of course, the second question is what's the process of delivering this water? Are the people, the vulnerable people, part of the decision-making process? Because if everything is done by some bureaucrats coming, from the capital and deciding what to do and where to do, with no engagement of the people, again, that's not rights-based. So providing the water on itself is not a human rights-based activity automatically. It does improve the access to human rights of some groups, but it could be done in a very discriminatory way at the same time. So that's the very kind of one example which shows that indeed human rights-based approach is required, in my view. Okay, I work in this field, so I'm a bit biased, of course, saying this, but is required to be at the very beginning kind of taught, not only in law courses, but in international development, in public policy making, in management, like public management, for people to understand all these nuances, which are now, I'm afraid, are far from being understood well. Okay, Van, please.
I may add, I mean, this HRBA really helps fine tune any policy, really. And like you get more bang for the buck in a sense with the type of work project you're trying to develop. And one thing I didn't mention is the participation, like you mentioned, of the children. And there was some, for example, in teaching Indigenous music in Ontario and in British Columbia, the children were, I'm talking about non-Indigenous children and Indigenous children in the classrooms, were so overjoyed to be doing this. It really filled them with so much, they were very interested in this project. So this kind of interest and enthusiasm is there. And using a HRBA, they should listen to these children and provide the music, right, that they want to do. I mean, so implementing HRBA in education policy will have many, many levels of benefits, definitely.
If I may just say, as we have a bit of time, that this kind of comprehensive approach that includes these, that is inclusive, that is participatory, that is results, also results oriented. This is, I would say, good governance generally, but is rooted in human rights as a value system. So that's quite important, because you can have kind of good governance that's not in the sense of efficiency, but maybe not human rights valued. And similarly, if you have just kind of many times I've seen in my own professional experience, a tendency of either nominal invocation and maybe formalistic invocation of human rights, adoption, there's lots of constitutions. I mean, Van, you had that wonderful slide with the long list of, there's tons of these norms and standards. And then we ask ourselves, so what does it mean, But I think particularly by picking up things like housing, education, like broad policy areas, it becomes more easily visible where the problem is and the opportunity is. And I think most people can gather it. For instance, education historically has been a question of not only structures of governance, but also questions of parents being involved, communities being involved. So it's really a question of connecting it with human rights. And housing, of course, now, I mean, the kind of work that Dr. Debaye and other people, that special rapporteurs in the last few years have done to really show us that, adequate housing is not merely the minimum of shelter. And so it's not adequate that the state just kind of adds some more places to shelter. But if we start to take this approach, what I like about it is it aims at something that human rights, we forget about human rights. Human rights is also about the fulfillment, the open-ended opportunity of the most that we can be, full lives in dignity and freedom, because a lot of human rights work and a lot of the big organizations are focused on minimum of kind of, this victim perpetrator paradigm. And it's like the state, this defense against the abuse as the kind of minimum standard, instead of saying, well, hang on here, there's a whole other vista of human rights, which is about fulfillment. And we've kind of missed a big part of that. When we talk about the human rights in normative terms, the essential aspect of dignity is not a minimalistic concept. And I think HRBA helps us realize that and specifically in applied policy terms. So it's my own take on it. And I have to tell you, I've spent a lot of years not paying attention to HRBA. So I knew it was around, but in my own work and work with other people, I have to admit, we did not much follow it. We were kind of preoccupied on the formalistic side. So I will admit that as a significant shortcoming. That's my own reflection from this. So I'm so glad, I'm glad that we're able to teach it a bit and have students. And I think it's interesting in this session too, that both people like Dr. Debaye and I, who also been focusing on human rights for a while, in addition to people like you, Van, who is new to human rights, that we're all kind of at the same point here. It's like, oh, okay, there's a real possibility here we need to grasp.
Thank you so much for these comments. And yeah, I can only join, actually, sharing on my experience. The first time I seriously came across human rights-based approach was when I started to work within the UN on a local development reform. And before that, I worked for years, like with Amnesty International, with some other human rights NGOs, worked in human rights field, like advancing human rights, but only when I kind of rethought the place of the human rights in the entire local development at that point kind of field, I understood that it's not just some element, that human rights do not come just as some extras to the business as usual, but human rights actually should be the framework for the business which is being done, for the things which are being done. So that's kind of the directing and guiding framework, which is a framework shaping how we do the things and what we do and to what end. Because I mean, in a way, when we came to local development at that point, and we were asking, so what we are doing? I mean, what is our purpose? And everybody would say, well, we're working to the benefit of the people. Okay, and so what is the benefit of the people? What do you mean by benefit of the people? And here you have all sorts of kind of variations. People saying that benefit of the people is economic growth, in like increasing the local budget, building more houses, building more buildings in the villages. But ultimately, if you look at this from this human rights-based point of view, well, we are here to provide the people opportunities for a life of dignity. Exactly what you just mentioned, Professor Parker. We are here to provide the fulfillment to people's lives, and that's what kind of the building this wealth for the people means. So yeah, I mean, it also took me quite a number of years to realize the full potential of the human rights-based approach and what it can do in many areas of our activity. Okay, so if there are no more questions to the panelists, then I would like maybe to once again give the floor to Professor Parker for some kind of concluding wrap-up ideas and remarks.
Thank you very much, Slava. I don't have much more to say. Oh, hang on. I see Dr.
David. Yes, I'm sorry. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, I don't. I know that we have till 3:30, and I was curious. I actually had a question for Lola. Unfortunately, she's gone. But I'll find a way to reach out to her. But then I have a question about your research. You mentioned, is the audio okay? Can you guys hear me now?
Yes, now it's good. Okay. Yes.
So then my question for you is, you mentioned something that kind of pricked up my ears, because you were talking about Indigenous education and the way that human rights relates to it, and how often we miss this opportunity actually to introduce human rights, HRBA, in the educational system, and specifically with regards to the treatment of First Nations and Indigenous peoples. I'm very interested in that. It's sort of one area of my research as it touches on Indigenous right to housing, First Nations right to housing. And you mentioned one of the things that you expect would be a de-genociding, as you put it, of the educational model. And I thought that's an interesting way of putting it. I've heard decolonizing. I'm sure everyone here has heard decolonizing. Is there a difference between de-genociding and decolonizing? That's my question.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I'm not an expert by any means on decolonization, and de-genociding is a word that I've come up with. What I find about decolonizing, if we look at the fort mentality that I've mentioned, it's still about deciding what we will take in and what we're ready to give up. It's what I mean by de-genociding. It's really more at the core of changing Canadian identity towards a fuller and a purer, not, I don't want to use pure, but something with more dignity, because we can't, like, you know, just put band-aids everywhere and say, okay, we're decolonizing. I feel perhaps it would be good to look into the possibility of reshaping Canadian identity to represent not only the last 200 years or 300 years of history, but the last 15,000 years of history. Because if we think about Indigenous theories and Indigenous knowledge, it's knowledge that comes from the land itself, and it's developed over thousands of years, and why are we ignoring this? Why are we, I mean, we are disconnected from this land. For the settler Canadian history is about building, you know, railroads across the land and ripping out forests and you know, mining the land, and the term, you know, that the land is being unused is unused. It's not a real Canadian concept. I mean, if we're going to use the word Canadian, so, and in an era where the environment is so important, and that our children learn about respecting the environment, the land, and acting, you know, being wiser, I think by de-genociding, I mean, by really going to the core and rethinking what human dignity is really all about, and also the dignity of the non-human, right, is a very valuable lesson we can learn from Indigenous theories. And yeah, definitely the genocide is something so destructive, and it's not only about killing people, it's about destroying culture. I mean, even if you destroy culture, you are actually committing the crime of genocide based on, right, the Raphael Lemkin's definition of genocide. So no, I mean, Canadians are not used to accepting that there's been a genocide here. I mean, unless, you know, you're kind of in this circle of people who know, but
I would note that this former Supreme Court Chief Justice did talk about cultural genocide, and that did cause a sensation. It was not easily, it was not something that went over very well. But there was at least some acknowledgement at the state level by someone who is an expert, of course, on law. So there was a step in the right direction, I guess. But as you say, it's not de-genociding, certainly.
If I'm not mistaken, the TRC explicitly claimed that there was a cultural genocide, and what became controversial was that you know, there were people at the time in the main cities writing newspapers saying many who said that was over the top, and that they shouldn't even call it cultural genocide. Some people called it genocide straight out, and it was oddly enough only after the report on the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls that our own Prime Minister then did say it was genocide, even though there was probably even more people who were doubtful. So, but I think, Van, your point is that Lemkin's original idea definitely included, I mean, I remember reading explicitly his passages about language, for example, and culture. He was very clear. And we know, strictly speaking, legally, the Genocide Convention did consider that and did not accept cultural genocide as within the, but that doesn't mean these things cannot evolve. You know, law is not immutable. But I love actually your point, Van, because, and I think it actually values the human rights-based approach in another aspect I'm not sure that we addressed, which that by being comprehensive and having these kind of elements, including the voices of those affected and so forth, we are challenged to think about our predicates and our assumptions. So, and you know, we like to say we should hear the authentic voices and so forth, but you know, are we really doing that? Or are we only hearing it? You know, one of the tendencies in which we fall into is we only hear them as victims, and we don't hear them in a fuller voice. You know, so your reference, Van, to 15,000 years of history, yeah, it's not just that there's a victimhood of the last couple hundred years or a few hundred years of settler colonialism. But there's actually, you know, 14,700 years of a voice that's not about being a victim. And so, yeah, I think there's so much in this that, and we're now going to struggle. You know, most Canadians will put the environment and climate change high up on the agenda. Well, it's not in our list of rights. You know, it only at the United Nations gained some recognition just this last year. but it's certainly not in our Charter of Rights. So, we're going to have to adjust. And again, I think a human rights-based approach challenges us, opens the door a bit. And I'm ready, by the way, immediately to say, of course, that this is itself limited. No matter how well you want to stretch the human rights-based approach, I think there will be some limits to it. Also, it's a paradigm in itself. It's a framework in itself. But I think we are in need of stretching ourselves. And I would say this is a good way. But the great question, David. And I also, my ears pricked up also the same thing. And I mean, this, I would say, also invites us to have some kind of follow-ups on this. I mean, from a pure budgetary perspective, education is usually about the largest, health and education are usually the two largest expenditures in public, on most countries in the world, public expenditures. And, it's kind of gobsmacking that we're not applying human rights-based approach to the two largest things we kind of do.
Thank you so much for these comments and the questions and the answers and the presentations in the first part of our event. So this is actually the second webinar taking place this year. The first one was the previous year. And like in the previous year, this webinar is in a way a follow-up to the course delivered this fall, past fall, sorry, at the University of Ottawa. But it seems from this discussion and from these 2 years of the course and the event that there is a need for a broader discussion, not just within this kind of, in a way, university environments webinar. I think more is required to be discussed at the broader Canadian stage and arena. And considering the fact that this year is the anniversary year for the Canadian Charter, it's probably a good time to actually ask a bit more loudly this question whether human rights-based approach should be incorporated, mainstreamed into the Charter, in some other frameworks which are relevant for the Canadian policy making and lawmaking. But even beyond this kind of big changes, I just want to stress once again, human rights-based approach could be applied everywhere. It could be applied within the big country, within a province, within a city, in a village, and within the institution. So all of these settings, of course, have some limitations. Some of them have limitations, but all of them could become the champions for showing to the others the example of how the human rights-based approach is practically applied and which fruits it can bring to the institution or the other setting. So this being said, I just would like once again to thank everyone for the participation. And I really hope that the research and practice of human rights does not stop here, that somehow human rights-based approach continues to live in your relevant research and in your practical work. And with this critical mass of people practicing and researching human rights-based approach, we can change the things for better in Canada.
Thank you very much, Slava. And let me also thank, we lost Lola because she had another activity she had to go to. So I will thank her in her absence, and I'll thank her personally separately. Thanks again to Van Armenian. I know that Van will continue to be thinking about and incorporating this because he's working on his PhD like you are, including human rights elements. Of course, Slava, you're working on it specifically. I'm expecting now from Dr. Debaye a new article sometime in the near future, looking at the human rights approach.
I've been warned. Thank you.
So we will see things forthcoming, I'm sure. But thanks to everyone for your contributions. A stimulating meeting. We have it recorded. We will share it through our networks. And let me also finally just say that this is part of our 40th anniversary of our own Human Rights Center. It's been two generations now that we've been trying to promote and advance human rights in different ways. And I draw the viewers' attention to our programmatic activities, please go to our website and check out HRREC or CREDP for our events. We have a number still in the next few months. Our anniversary goes through the end of June. We will be, among other things, having some elements touching on HRBA still. For example, in a gathering we're organizing on the 40th anniversary of the Charter, so that we will also comparatively discuss. So please pay attention to that. Thanks again to everyone. Merci beaucoup et à la prochaine.